Welcome to Audio Notebook. I want you to start off today by thinking about the movie of your life.
Right. The one playing in all of our heads.
You know the exact one I'm talking about. You wake up in the morning, you make your coffee, you pursue your career, you look for love, you try to stay healthy.
Yeah.
And in this movie, you are undeniably the main character. Every single decision you make feels like it's yours, driven by your desires, your goals, your fundamental need to survive and thrive.
Of course. That's the human experience.
Right. But what if I told you that, biologically speaking, you aren't the main character at all?
Oh, man. This is where it gets dark.
It really does.
Right.
Because what if your entire sense of individual purpose is basically just a brilliantly engineered illusion?
Yeah.
What if you are, in fact, just a temporary survival machine, like a giant, lumbering, fleshy robot built by invisible microscopic entities that are just using you for their own perpetuation?
I mean, it is a profoundly unsettling thought. Just to realize that you sitting there listening to this is essentially a highly sophisticated rental car.
A rental car. Exactly.
Yeah, and the drivers, the things actually steering the course of history are microscopic fragments of information that have been on the road for billions of years.
It's completely mind-bending.
Yeah.
And that perspective shift, honestly, is exactly our mission for this edition of Audio Notebook.
It's a big one.
We are going to fundamentally reorient how you understand evolution, biology, and really your own daily existence.
Right.
We're going to stop looking at nature through the lens of individuals or species fighting to survive, and we're going to zoom all the way in to the absolute fundamental unit of natural selection.
And to really appreciate how radical this shift in thinking is, we need to set the historical stage a bit.
Okay, let's do it.
So for a very long time after Charles Darwin published his theories in the 19th century, the scientific consensus viewed the individual organism as the primary agent of natural selection.
Which makes intuitive sense, right?
Totally. Darwin looked at finches, at tortoises, at pigeons. He saw whole animals interacting with their environments.
Yeah. Right, because that's what we can see with our eyes. You see a bird with a slightly sharper beak, it manages to crack open more seeds, it survives a drought, and it has more babies.
Exactly.
So, the individual bird is the star of the evolutionary show.
Well, wait, let me rephrase that. That is the classical way to view it.
Oh, okay.
In that view, the individual interacts with the physical world. You are the entity that feels the cold wind or runs away from a predator.
Right.
But the mid-20th century brought a paradigm-shattering shift in biology. Science developed the tools to look deeper than the beak, deeper than the bird itself.
Like getting down to the molecular level.
Exactly. We discovered DNA, we began to really understand the mechanics of heredity, and that led to what we call the gene-centered view of evolution.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because you're saying that the individual, the bird, the human, the elephant, isn't actually the thing that evolution is looking at.
That is the core of the argument, yeah. Think about the lifespan of an individual. We are born, we live, and we die. We are incredibly ephemeral.
You just don't last.
We simply do not last. Therefore, an individual cannot be the ultimate unit that natural selection is accumulating over millions of years.
Oh, I see. Because the unit has to stick around to be selected.
Exactly. This new paradigm argued that the real permanent units of selection are the genes themselves. And this wasn't just a slight change in emphasis, It was a total reassessment of the biological hierarchy.
Wow.
It emerged because the old individual-centric view simply couldn't explain some of the most baffling, counterintuitive phenomena in nature.
Well, I know we have a stack of wild examples to get through today. Animals sacrificing themselves, DNA attacking itself.
Yeah.
But before we talk about animals or humans or even DNA as we recognize it today, we need to ground this.
Let's do it.
Take us all the way back. Let's go to the very beginning. Before cells, before life, where does this whole selfish biological logic actually originate?
Right. So to understand what a gene actually is at its core, we have to look at how chemical stability eventually transitioned into biological replication. Let's imagine the early Earth, roughly 4 billion years ago. It is not a hospitable place. It is a violent, churning void of simple chemical compounds.
Like a toxic ocean.
Yeah, we are talking about oceans filled with carbon dioxide, cyanide, water, ammonia. And this toxic soup is being constantly baked by intense, unfiltered ultraviolet light from the sun. It's being shocked by geothermal heat from below and struck by continuous lightning.
So it's just a chaotic, boiling cauldron of basic dead chemistry.
Nothing was alive, There was no biology, which means there was no survival of the fittest in the Darwinian sense.
Right, because nothing is trying to survive.
Exactly. Instead, there was only a fundamental physical principle at play, the law of stability. In chemistry, unstable configurations of atoms tend to fall apart, while more stable configurations of atoms endure.
Okay.
If a random jolt of lightning fused some atoms into a highly unstable blob, the chaotic energy of the ocean just dissolved it back into the soup a second later.
But if it was stable, it stayed.
Right. If atoms happened to fuse into something stable, that configuration stuck around.
That makes sense. It's
Yeah.
just physics. A rock doesn't, try to be a rock.
Yeah.
It's just a rock because its atomic structure is in a stable arrangement.
Spot on. So, over millions and millions of years, these random jolts of energy occasionally combine simple chemical blobs into more complex, stable compounds.
Okay.
But then, a critical milestone occurred. It is arguably the most important accident in the history of our planet. A unique molecule accidentally formed that had a very special property.
What was it?
It had a chemical affinity for its own building blocks.
Okay, what does that mean in practice? How does that work in this soup?
It means that due to its specific chemical shape, it would naturally attract similar, smaller molecules from the surrounding soup.
Oh, like a magnet.
Yeah, those smaller pieces would adhere to it, lining up alongside it. Eventually, those smaller pieces would bond to each other, forming a complete copy of the original structure.
Whoa.
And this was the birth of the first replicator.
I want to pause here because I want to make sure I really grasp the sheer improbability of
It's
this.
staggering.
It's like taking a billion puzzle pieces, throwing them into a giant industrial washing machine, and just leaving it running.
Yes.
For a million years, nothing happens except noise and pieces bumping together. But then, purely by chance, two pieces happen to snap together in a specific way.
Right.
And that new shape acts like a magnet, pulling in other specific puzzle pieces from the swirling water to build a perfect replica of itself.
That is a highly effective way to visualize it. It was statistically incredibly unlikely for this specific molecule to form on any given day.
Sure.
But the timescales available were so vast, hundreds of millions of years of this chemical washing machine constantly running, that the unlikely became virtually inevitable.
Wow. Okay, so once you have one, what happens?
Once that single replicator appeared, the rules of the planet changed forever. It didn't just sit there. Because it could copy itself, it began to fill the environment at an exponential pace.
Right, because 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8.
Exactly. It started consuming the available free-floating chemical building blocks to produce more and more copies.
Okay, I follow the chemistry. But if it's just, mindlessly pulling in puzzle pieces and making copies of itself, how do we get from that to actual competition?
Yeah.
How do we get to a cheetah chasing down a gazelle?
Well, we get competition because the physical copying process was not perfect. Imagine trying to perfectly photocopy a document a million times. Eventually, dust on the glass or a glitch in the software introduces an error.
Like a typo.
Right. In the primordial soup, stray UV light or fluctuations in the chemical bath caused errors during the copying process. These were the first mutations.
Okay.
So now you don't just have one uniform army of replicators, you have a population of slightly different variants.
And because those free-floating building blocks in the soup, the raw puzzle pieces, are a finite resource, these different variants are now inadvertently competing for them.
You've hit on the core mechanism. They aren't consciously fighting. They don't have brains or desires. They are simply chemically consuming the same limited resources. And this introduces the 3 absolute pillars of evolutionary success. Any replicator that possessed these 3 traits naturally outcopied the others over time.
What are the 3 pillars?
The first is longevity or stability.
Okay.
If a mutated replicator is physically tougher, maybe its chemical bonds are slightly stronger and it resists breaking down longer than its rivals, it literally has more time to make copies of itself.
Makes sense.
The second is fecundity, or copying speed. If a replicator can attract building blocks and finish a copy in 1 hour while a rival takes 2 hours, the faster one will quickly dominate the resource pool.
Live longer, copy faster. That seems straightforward. What's the third?
Fidelity, copying accuracy.
Oh, right, because of the mutation.
Exactly. This is crucial. If a replicator is fast and tough, but its copying process is so sloppy that its offspring don't actually inherit those fast and tough traits, that lineage will just fizzle out into unstable nonsense.
Yeah, you lose the advantage.
High fidelity ensures that the beneficial winning traits are preserved across generations. Longevity, fecundity, fidelity, these are the uncompromising metrics of success.
So the primordial soup starts getting crowded. The free-floating building blocks are running out. Some replicators are fast, some are stable. What happens when the resources dry up entirely?
They have to get creative again, purely by accidental mutation.
Right.
Some replicators stumbled upon chemical ways to actively break up rival replicators and steal their building blocks.
Oh, so they started dismantling each other.
Yes. These were the first microscopic predators. Other replicators stumbled upon ways to build chemical walls around themselves, perhaps a protective protein coating or a lipid layer, to defend against those attacks.
Okay.
And this was the very first scaffolding.
The first bodies.
Yes, exactly. Over 4 billion years, that simple chemical scaffolding became increasingly intricate, increasingly indirect.
Right.
It evolved into complex cellular machinery, then multicellular tissues, then the organs, the limbs, the nervous systems of bacteria, plants, fungi, and eventually us.
That's incredible.
So when we look at a human being, or a redwood tree, or a blue whale, we are looking at the unimaginably complex modern scaffolding built by the direct descendants of those original primordial replicators.
And today, those replicators are what we call genes.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we are just the descendant scaffolding, the protective walls built by these ancient chemical copiers,
Right.
why do we feel so incredibly distinct?
Right.
Why do I feel like I am the one evolving and succeeding?
Because of a powerful illusion created by the structure of biology, specifically the fundamental difference between what we call a replicator and a vehicle.
A vehicle.
Yes, some biologists call it an interactor. This is a crucial distinction that drives the entire gene-centered view.
Let's lay that out clearly. What exactly is the difference?
Well, a replicator is defined as any entity of which copies are made. In modern biology, these are fragments of DNA. And it's important to clarify that a gene isn't just a physical molecule.
It's not.
No, it's the information encoded in that molecule. Think about it. The physical DNA molecule you were born with is not the exact same physical molecule you'll die with.
Oh, right. Because my cells keep dividing and replacing atoms.
Precisely. Your cells constantly divide, repair, and replace atoms. But the information, the specific sequence of base pairs, the A's, C's, T's, and G's, persists.
Okay.
A gene is a unit of information that can persist for an evolutionarily significant span of time through a lineage of successful copies.
And the vehicle.
The vehicle is you. It's the individual organism. It is a relatively discrete, temporary entity that houses the replicators.
Right.
It is the complex machine programmed to preserve and propagate those replicators. Natural selection looks like it's scrutinizing the vehicle because genes don't present themselves naked to the environment.
Right. A strand of DNA doesn't just float out into the snow to see if it survives the winter.
Exactly. I mean, you have the right idea. It builds a phenotype.
A phenotype.
Yeah. A phenotype is the physical expression of a gene. A gene builds a physical trait, like thick white fur on a polar bear, and that physical trait interacts with the freezing environment.
Got it.
It's the differential success of those physical traits that determines which underlying informational codes actually get copied and increase in frequency in the population.
So I really am just a rental car for my DNA. I'm the heavy machinery it drives around to keep itself safe.
In a strict biological sense, yes, you are the vehicle. And the reason the individual cannot be the true unit of selection comes down to the technical, mechanical logic of how we reproduce.
Okay.
It's a concept related to what evolutionary biologists call the ephemeral genotype.
Ephemeral meaning fleeting, temporary. What makes my genotypes temporary?
Think about sexual reproduction. You possess a unique, one-of-a-kind genotype. There has never been another human with your exact combination of genes, and barring artificial cloning, there never will be again. Let's say you are highly successful in your environment. You're strong, smart, highly immune to local diseases. You have a winning genetic hand.
Okay, sounds good for me.
But when you reproduce, you do not pass on that winning hand intact.
Wait, if I have a winning hand, why wouldn't I pass the whole thing on? Why does sexual reproduction work the way it does?
Well, it comes down to a cellular process called meiosis. That's what creates sperm and egg cells.
Right.
And during meiosis, your chromosomes literally line up and undergo a process called crossing over and recombination. They swap chunks of DNA with each other.
Let's shuffle everything up.
The genetic deck is completely, thoroughly shuffled. Your unique, successful genotype is shattered and broken apart before it can be passed on.
Wow.
An evolutionary biologist named George C. Williams argued this point emphatically. He pointed out that natural selection simply cannot produce cumulative, complex change if the entity being selected is destroyed in every single generation.
Oh, that makes total sense. You cannot build a complex adaptation if the blueprints are shredded every time you try to copy them.
Exactly.
Oh, let me see if I can map this to something familiar.
Go for it.
If I have a recipe for the most amazing chocolate chip cookie in the world, the perfect combination of butter, sugar, and flour. But the rules of my kitchen say that every time I give the recipe to my daughter, I have to tear my recipe card in half, throw half away, and tape it together with a random half of a recipe from her father's cookbook.
Right.
After a few generations, my perfect cookie recipe is gone completely.
That is a very solid way to visualize it. The specific recipe, the individual organism is entirely lost, but what does survive that tearing and taping process?
The individual words.
Yes, the
Right.
individual words on the paper. The distinct instructions like add sugar or bake at 350. Those specific modular components pass through the generations intact, even as the whole recipe changes.
Okay.
In biology, those components are the alleles, the specific variations of genes. Therefore, the logical conclusion is that selection must act on those enduring components, not the temporary combination of them.
That makes total sense, but it raises a technical question for me.
Sure.
Why is the gene the magic unit? If we're looking for things that survive the shuffling, why isn't the unit of selection a whole chromosome? Or conversely, why isn't it just a single letter of DNA, a single nucleotide?
That brings us to a sort of Goldilocks rule of genetics.
The Goldilocks rule. I like that.
The unit of selection has to be a segment of DNA that is exactly the right size to survive that continuous shuffling of the deck over multiple generations while still being meaningful.
Okay.
Let's look at the extremes. If we look at a single nucleotide, one single letter of DNA, like an adenine or guanine, it's too small.
Right.
It generally doesn't encode enough information to exert a meaningful physical trait that the environment can see and select for or against. It's like a single letter E in a book. It doesn't convey a concept on its own.
Right. And E doesn't help me survive.
Yeah.
The whole chromosome.
The whole chromosome is vastly too large. Because of that crossing over process we just talked about during meiosis, a whole chromosome is almost mathematically guaranteed to be chopped up and rearranged.
It's just too big of a target for the scissors.
Yes. It lacks the fidelity we established as a pillar of the primordial soup. So the gene, or sometimes a small, tightly linked group of genes that usually travel together, is the ideal functional unit.
Just the right size.
It is long enough to encode a functional trait, like eye color or a digestive enzyme, but physically short enough to mathematically avoid being split apart by crossing over, allowing it to be faithfully copied and transmitted through the gene pool intact for millions of years.
Okay, this is a massive perspective shift, but I have a major glaring problem with it.
Timmy.
We've just established that genes are fundamentally these ruthless, selfish replicators. Their only imperative, dating back to the primordial soup, is to outcopy each other.
Correct.
If the whole system is built on this cutthroat competition, why is nature so full of animals being nice to each other?
The paradox of altruism.
Yes. I mean, if I am a selfish gene, and my only goal is to make more of myself, any behavior that puts my vehicle at risk to help someone else should be immediately wiped out by evolution.
Right.
If a bird gives up its food for another bird, it starves, its genes die, end of story. So why does altruism exist at all in a selfish system?
You've hit on what was one of the greatest headaches in evolutionary biology. For decades, it seemed to contradict the very foundation of natural selection.
I can see why.
That is, until the 1960s, when a brilliant evolutionary biologist named W.D. Hamilton mathematically resolved it.
Okay.
He introduced a concept called inclusive fitness, and it hinges on a very simple yet profound realization. Natural selection favors genes that promote the success of copies of themselves, regardless of which physical body those copies currently reside in.
Wait, so the gene inside me doesn't care if it's in my body, as long as an identical copy of it survives somewhere else.
That is the crux of it. Hamilton formalized this with an elegant mathematical equation known as Hamilton's rule. It looks like this. RB is greater than C.
Okay, let's walk through the math on this because I want to make sure I'm tracking the logic.
Mm-hmm.
R times B is greater than C. What do those variables represent?
Let's start with the right side of the equation. C is the reproductive cost to the actor.
Okay.
That's the risk you take, the calories you burn, or the potential offspring you sacrificed by performing the altruistic act.
So if I give you my sandwich, I might starve.
Yeah.
That's the cost.
Right. B is the reproductive benefit to the recipient, how much your act materially helps them survive and reproduce.
Okay.
And the multiplier on the left side, the magic variable, is R. That is the coefficient of relatedness.
The coefficient of relatedness. What does that mean in plain English?
It is the exact mathematical probability that a specific gene in your body is identical by descent to a gene in the recipient's body.
The probability that we share the exact same selfish gene.
Yes. Let's break down those coefficients. If you have an identical twin, they are a biological clone. Your coefficient of relatedness, your R, is 1.0.
100%.
You share 100% of your genes. So mathematically, your genes should be willing to endure almost any cost up to and including giving up your own life if it guarantees your twin's survival.
Wow.
Why? Because from the gene's perspective, the exact same information survives anyway. The vehicle is destroyed, but the replicators live on.
Okay, but identical twins are rare. What about a regular sibling, or a parent, or a child?
Because of the way meiosis halves our genetic material, you share exactly half your genetic material with a full sibling, a parent, or a child. So for them, R is 0.5.
Okay.
For natural selection to favor an altruistic act toward a sibling, the benefit to them must be more than double the cost to you.
Right.
If we move a step further out to a grandparent, a grandchild, an uncle, or an aunt, the genetic link dilutes. The R becomes 0.25. You share a quarter of your genes.
So the benefit has to be even higher.
Exactly. The benefit of your altruism must be more than quadruple the cost to yourself. For a first cousin, R is 0.125. You share 1/8 of your genes.
Let me translate this into a real-world scenario.
Oh.
If I'm looking at a burning building purely from the cold, calculating perspective of my genes, saving 2 of my siblings is mathematically identical to saving my own life.
Correct.
Because 2 times 50% equals 100% of my genetic material. Or saving 4 of my nephews, or saving 8 of my first cousins. My genes literally do not care if I die in the fire, as long as 8 of my cousins make it out to reproduce.
That is the exact unfeeling calculus of inclusive fitness, and we see this playing out in the real world continuously.
Really? Like where?
Take California ground squirrels. When a predator, like a hawk or a coyote, approaches, a squirrel will often stand up on its hind legs and emit a loud, piercing alarm call.
Which seems like a terrible idea if you want to hide.
It is. This is highly altruistic because it draws the predator's attention directly to the caller, significantly increasing the squirrel's own chance of being eaten.
That's why they do it.
Field studies have shown they are vastly more likely to make these alarm calls when they are surrounded by close genetic relatives. The calling squirrel sacrifices its own vehicle, but the genes for the alarm call survive in the bodies of the siblings and offspring that hear the warning and escape into the burrows.
It's like the gene is playing a massive game of chess across multiple bodies.
Yeah.
Are there other examples of this kind of family-based altruism?
There are countless examples. Look at vervet monkeys. They practice a behavior called allomothering. Female vervets will spend massive amounts of time and energy babysitting, grooming, and aggressively protecting infants that aren't theirs.
Oh, wow.
Now, who are they helping? They aren't just helping random strangers in the troop. They are almost exclusively helping their sisters' or daughters' infants. They are ensuring the survival of their own genes housed in different vehicles.
It fundamentally redefines what the word selfish means in biology. The gene is fundamentally selfish, but it produces altruistic, cooperative behavior in the vehicle to serve that invisible selfishness.
You've summarized it perfectly. And the most extreme, mind-blowing example of this kin-driven altruism is found in eusociality.
Like bees,
Exactly. Think of bees, ants, and certain wasps.
where you have worker bees that literally don't reproduce at all. They just work, build the hive, sting intruders, and die for the queen.
Yes. The vast majority of the colony, the workers, are completely sterile females.
Yeah.
They give up their own reproduction entirely.
Which makes no sense initially.
From a classical individual selection standpoint, this is utterly impossible. A sterile individual has an evolutionary fitness of 0. Those traits should vanish instantly from the gene pool.
Right.
But if you look at the deep genetics of eusociality, it makes perfect, stunning mathematical sense.
How so? Walk me through the math of a beehive.
It comes down to a quirky genetic system in these insects called haplodiploidy. In most animals, like us, both males and females are diploid, meaning we have 2 sets of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad.
50-50.
But in bees, it's different. Queens are diploid, they have 2 sets. But males, the drones, develop from unfertilized eggs. They are haploid.
Okay, so they only have 1 set.
Yes, they only have 1 set of chromosomes, which they get entirely from the queen.
Wait, Males don't have fathers?
Correct. A drone has no father, only a mother. Because of this bizarre setup, the way genes are shared among siblings is wildly skewed.
How skewed?
Well, when a queen mates with a single drone, all the female workers she produces get the exact same set of chromosomes from the father. Because he only has one set to give, they share 100% of their paternal genes.
Wow.
And they get a random half of the queen's genes. When you average it out, sister bees share 75% of their genes with each other.
Okay, let me do the math. So sisters are 75% related to each other, but a worker bee would only share 50% of her genes with her own offspring if she could somehow have them.
Exactly. And there is the incredible evolutionary punchline. Female workers share 75% of their genes with their sisters, but only 50% with their potential daughters.
Oh my God.
So, mathematically, what is the most efficient way for a worker bee's genes to make copies of themselves? It is not to have their own babies. The return on investment is lower.
The best strategy is to make more sisters.
Yes. The absolute best strategy is to turn their mother, the queen, into a massive, continuous, sibling-producing factory.
That is wild.
The workers give up their individual reproductive rights because the genetics dictate that investing in sisters yields a 25% higher return on genetic investment. It definitively proves that the interests of the individual organism are completely subordinate to the interests of the genes. The individual's desire to reproduce is hijacked by the gene's desire to maximize representation.
Okay, my mind is thoroughly blown by the haplodiploid bees, but I have another wrench to throw into this theory.
Throw it.
We've established that genes can cooperate if they're in different bodies that share family ties. But generally speaking, we think of the body, the primary vehicle, as a unified team. I assume all the genes inside my body are working together to keep me alive so we can all reproduce together, right? I mean, we are all in the same boat.
Yeah.
What happens when genes inside the exact same body disagree?
This is where we shatter the illusion of genomic harmony. We naturally like to think of our genome as a beautiful, synchronized orchestra, all playing the same symphony to build a healthy human.
Yeah, that's what you're taught in school.
But the reality is that the genome is not a unified cooperative at all. It is a cutthroat battleground of autonomous agents.
Oh boy.
If the individual were truly the unit of selection, every gene would row in the exact same direction. But the discovery of intergenomic conflict genes actively fighting other genes within the very same cell proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that genes are out for themselves.
Give me an example of genes fighting inside a body. How does that even work mechanically?
Let's look at a phenomenon called meiotic drive. Under standard rules of inheritance, meiosis, the creation of sperm and egg cells, is completely fair. It's a coin flip. If a male has two different variations of a gene on a pair of chromosomes, let's call them allele A and allele B, each sperm cell he produces has exactly a 50% chance of getting allele A and a 50% chance of getting allele B. It's fair and balanced.
Makes sense.
But sometimes a selfish genetic element evolves to subvert this fairness.
Like a genetic cheater.
Precisely. One of the best studied examples of this is the segregation distorter, or SD system, found in Drosophila, the fruit fly.
What does the SD system do?
If a male fruit fly carries one normal allele and one SD allele, the SD allele essentially commits microscopic sabotage. During the physical development of the sperm in the testes, the SD allele produces toxic proteins.
Toxic proteins in its own body.
Yes. These proteins actively target and incapacitate or destroy any sperm cells that carry the rival, normal allele.
Are you kidding me? It literally murders the competition inside the fly's own tests. How does it know which sperm to kill?
It's incredibly insidious. The toxin targets specific structural vulnerabilities on the homologous chromosome, the partner chromosome carrying the rival gene. The SD gene protects itself from its own toxin, but the rival chromosome fractures or fails to condense properly. The result is that instead of a 50-50 split in the viable sperm, the SD allele is transmitted to nearly 100% of the offspring. It massively artificially inflates its own transmission rate.
But wait, if the SD gene is killing off half of the fly's sperm, doesn't that make the male fly way less fertile overall? That seems terrible for the fly.
It is terrible for the fly. The overall fertility of the male plummets. He will have far fewer offspring than a normal male.
So why doesn't evolution weed it out?
Because the SD gene simply does not care about the fly's overall fertility. It only cares about its own proportional representation in the next generation. It would rather be in 100% of 50 offspring than 50% of 100 offspring.
That is just It's just pure math.
Exactly. This is absolute, undeniable proof that a gene's success in propagation can come at a direct, severe cost to the individual vehicle's fitness.
That is ruthless. What else is lurking in our DNA doing stuff like this?
Have you ever heard of transposable elements or jumping genes?
I think so. Didn't the geneticist Barbara McClintock discover those?
She did, studying maize in the mid-20th century, and she rightfully won a Nobel Prize for it. Transposons are essentially genetic parasites living inside our own DNA.
Parasites. Made of DNA.
Yeah. They are segments of DNA that have one singular function. They encode enzymes that allow them to replicate themselves and insert the new copy back into a random location within the host's genome. They just copy and paste, proliferating wildly across your chromosomes.
Like a computer virus filling up a hard drive.
That's a very accurate comparison. And they're largely parasitic because this constant copying and pasting causes serious structural problems.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, when a transposon pastes itself into a new location, it might land right in the middle of a vital functional gene, disrupting its code and causing deleterious mutations or diseases.
Oh, that's bad.
Furthermore, simply replicating all that extra useless DNA places a massive metabolic strain on the host cell. The cell wastes precious energy and resources copying these parasitic genes instead of doing its actual job of keeping the organism alive.
They still survive.
They survive and thrive. In fact, they make up huge percentages of the genomes in many plants and animals. Roughly half of the human genome is made up of transposable elements or their decayed remnants.
Half of our genome is just junk mail that copies itself.
Basically, yes. Their survival, despite the harm and inefficiency they cause the host, again proves that genes are selected based purely on their own replicative success, not for the good of the organism.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. I'm picturing the human body like a massive multinational corporation. We always thought the genome was the board of directors, all sitting at the table, working together to make the company profitable.
Right, the team players.
But what you're describing is a corporation where half the executives are actively embezzling funds, sabotaging each other's departments, and planting computer viruses on the company servers, and yet somehow the company still manages to sell products and function.
That captures the chaos perfectly. And the corporate espionage goes even deeper when you look at a phenomenon called genomic imprinting.
Okay, what is that?
It reveals a literal biological tug of war between mothers and fathers taking place inside the body of their own child.
Wait, the mother's genes and the father's genes fight inside the baby. How is that possible?
It's a concept called parent-offspring conflict, driven by genomic imprinting. Imprinting is an epigenetic process where certain genes behave differently. They are turned on or turned off depending purely on whether you inherited them from your mother or your father.
Okay, but why would evolution favor that?
Because mathematically, the evolutionary interests of the maternal genes and paternal genes are not perfectly aligned when it comes to resource allocation during pregnancy.
I don't get that. Don't both parents want the baby to survive and be healthy?
Yes, they both want survival, but with very different caveats regarding cost. Let's look at the paternal interest, the father's genes operating inside the fetus.
Right.
The father's genes are selected to extract as much biological resource as possible from the mother during pregnancy to ensure this specific offspring grows as large and robust as possible.
Okay.
From an evolutionary standpoint, the father's genes are indifferent to the mother's long-term health or her ability to have future children because in nature, those future children might be sired by a different male. The father's genes get no benefit from the mother saving her energy.
Oh, wow. So the dad's genes in the placenta are basically yelling, take everything, drain the batteries, who cares if the factory burns down,
Yeah.
just build this one perfect car.
Precisely the strategy. But the maternal interest is distinctly different. The mother's genes, also sitting inside that exact same fetus, advocate for restraint. The mother's genes want this offspring to survive, yes, but they also desperately need to preserve the mother's health and metabolic reserves so she can survive the birth and produce more offspring in the future offspring who will also carry her genes.
So the mom's genes are countering with, hey, take enough to live, but leave some reserves for your future brothers and sisters.
Exactly. And we see this molecular tug of war happening physically in the cells. Look at research on the GERB10 gene, which is deeply involved in regulating fetal growth.
How does that gene work?
The paternally inherited version of the gene typically pushes for maximum demand for maternal resources. It promotes a larger placenta, highly aggressive nutrient extraction from the mother's bloodstream.
And the mom's version?
Meanwhile, the maternally inherited version of the same gene actively works to counteract that paternal aggressive signaling, promoting restraint and limiting growth to a sustainable level. It is a literal battleground of competing genetic strategies happening at the molecular level inside the womb.
That is just. It really reframes how you view yourself. You aren't a unified whole. You are a tenuous, temporary treaty between competing microscopic factions.
That's a great way to put it.
But let's take this a step further. We've talked about genes manipulating the internal environment of the vehicle, fighting inside the cell or the womb. Can genes manipulate the outside world? Can a gene's influence reach beyond the physical borders of the body it lives in?
Absolutely. And this brings us to one of the most visionary and expansive concepts in modern biology, proposed by Richard Dawkins. It's called the extended phenotype.
Okay, let's make sure we have the terminology locked down. Genotype is the code, phenotype is the physical result. Like the gene for blue eyes makes the phenotype of a blue iris.
Right. Traditional evolutionary views limit those phenotypic effects strictly to the physical body of the organism itself: teeth, fur, eye color, bone density.
Right, the stuff attached to you.
But Dawkins argued that this boundary, the skin of the organism, is completely arbitrary. He proposed that the phenotypic effects of a gene can extend out into the environment and, shockingly, even into the bodies of other living organisms.
How can a gene reach into the environment? Are we talking about tools?
Let's start with architectural constructions built by animals. Think of a beaver dam.
Okay, a beaver dam.
A beaver dam is not just a random byproduct of a beaver being busy. The complex behavior of cutting specific trees, weaving branches in a specific pattern, and packing mud to create a barrier that floods a specific area is genetically hardwired.
It's just built into their code.
It's an instinct encoded in DNA. If a random mutation in a beaver's DNA leads to a fundamentally flawed dam-building behavior, say, building a dam that leaks easily or washes away in a mild current that beavers lodge will flood, its offspring will freeze or be eaten by predators, and those faulty dam-building genes will not be passed on.
So the quality of the dam directly determines the survival of the genes inside the beaver.
Yes. Therefore, the dam itself, the physical structure made of dead wood and mud sitting in the river, is literally a physical manifestation of the beaver's genes, just as much as the beaver's sharp teeth or its flat, scaly tail. The dam is an extended phenotype.
Wow.
The gene's influence has skipped outside the body to manipulate the river ecosystem to ensure its own survival.
That is wild. But it makes logical sense. The gene alters the world to protect the vehicle. Are there other examples of animals building things that act as phenotypes?
Termite mounds are a fantastic example. Termite colonies build these towering cathedral-like mounds out of dirt and saliva.
Yeah, I've seen pictures. They're huge.
And they aren't just piles of dirt. They are highly engineered dynamic climate control systems. They have internal ventilation shafts that precisely regulate temperature, humidity, and oxygen levels deep inside the nest where the colony keeps its fungus gardens.
And that's all genetic.
Yes. The architectural geometry of that mound is a genetically determined trait that directly ensures the survival of the colony and the transmission of the colony's genes. Or consider spider webs. The exact geometric architecture of the web and the specific chemical adhesive properties of the silk are coded by genes. The web is a physical extension of the spider's genome, cast out into the wind to catch food.
Okay, this is fascinating, but earlier you said something that caught my ear and I need to circle back to it.
What was it?
You said a phenotype could extend into the environment and into the bodies of other living organisms. A spiderweb made of silk is one thing, but can a gene's phenotype actually be the behavior of another living, breathing creature?
Yes, and this is where the concept of the extended phenotype gets undeniably dark. We are talking about parasite-host manipulation.
Oh boy.
In these cases, the genes of a parasite are physically expressed as radical changes in the behavior or morphology of the host organism, purely to benefit the parasite's transmission. The parasite's genes effectively hijack the host's nervous system.
Oh, this sounds like science fiction horror. Give me the details. How does a parasite hijack a brain?
Let's look at the hairworm from the phylum Nematodorpha. These worms infect insects, primarily crickets.
Okay.
The microscopic worm larva is ingested by the cricket. It then grows inside the cricket's body cavity, absorbing nutrients, eventually growing into a worm that can be several times longer than the cricket itself, just coiled up inside.
Gross.
But here's the problem. The adult hairworm needs to be in an aquatic environment to mate and lay eggs. Crickets, however, generally avoid deep water because they can't swim well.
So the worm is trapped in a dry vehicle. How does it get to the water?
The hairworm's genes go to work. They produce specific proteins and neurotransmitter mimics that cross into the cricket's central nervous system, completely overriding its natural survival instincts.
It literally hacks the brain.
It induces an intense, suicidal attraction to water. The cricket will actively seek out a pond, a stream, or even a puddle and hurl itself in, drowning itself.
Oh, no way.
Yes. And at that exact moment, the adult hairworm bursts out of the dying cricket's exoskeleton and swims away to reproduce. The suicidal drowning behavior of the cricket is the extended phenotype of the worm's genes.
That is absolutely horrifying. The worm is driving the cricket like a rented car straight off a cliff. What else? Tell me there's more.
Nature is full of these macabre profiteers. Consider the lancet liver fluke. It's a tiny flatworm that needs to end up inside the digestive tract of a grazing mammal, like a sheep or a cow, to complete its life cycle and reproduce.
Okay.
But part of its larval stage is spent inside an ant. Now, ants usually crawl on the ground. Cows do not generally eat ground ants, so the fluke must force the ant into the cow's mouth.
How does it manage that?
The fluke migrates into the ant's brain cluster and takes control. When the temperature cools in the evening, the exact time herbivores graze instead of returning to the nest, the infected ant is compelled by the fluke's chemical signals to climb to the very top of a blade of grass.
Just to wait there.
Yes. It clamps its jaws shut onto the tip of the grass in a titanic death grip and simply waits there, completely immobile, maximizing the chances that a grazing sheep will accidentally eat it the next morning.
The ant is literally serving itself up on a silver platter because the fluke's genes reprogrammed its brain.
That's exactly right. Or look at something more familiar to us, the rabies virus. It infects mammals, including dogs, bats, and humans.
Right.
How does a virus that relies on transmission through saliva ensure it gets into a new host? It can't just hope the host accidentally drools on an open wound.
Right. That's not very efficient.
The viral genes migrate to the brain and induce two specific radical behavioral changes in the infected animal. Extreme, uncharacteristic aggression, and hydrophobia, a terrifying fear of water.
Oh, I see the logic. The fear of water means the animal refuses to drink, which keeps the virus highly concentrated in the foaming saliva in the mouth.
Yes.
And the aggression makes the animal want to bite things, injecting the concentrated virus into a new host.
You've connected the dots perfectly. The aggression and the hydrophobia are the extended phenotypes of the viral genome. One last example, because it is visually so dramatic. The baculovirus, which infects caterpillars.
Oh, okay. What does that do?
It induces something biologists call cement disease. A healthy caterpillar usually hides from birds and predators by staying in the lower foliage. But when infected with this virus, the caterpillar's brain is flooded with chemical signals driving an overwhelming urge to climb to the absolute highest point it can reach on the tree.
And summit disease.
Right. Once it reaches the summit, it locks on and dies. But the viral genes aren't done. They trigger the production of enzymes that literally liquefy the caterpillar's internal organs and exoskeleton.
Ew, it melts it.
Yes. The host's body melts into a gooey, highly infectious liquid, raining millions of viral particles down onto the leaves below to infect the next generation of caterpillars feeding there.
Oh my God, summit disease. That is a brutal visual, but it perfectly illustrates your point. The caterpillar climbing isn't a caterpillar behavior anymore. It's the virus's genes executing a software program on the caterpillar's hardware.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. These horrifying examples highlight what we call the central theorem of the extended phenotype. The theorem states that an animal's behavior tends to maximize the survival of the genes for that behavior, whether or not those genes happen to reside in the body of the particular animal performing the behavior. It doesn't matter whose body it is, the gene pulls the strings.
Okay, let's zoom out from mind-controlling worms and melting caterpillars. I want to look at the big picture.
Okay.
If you look at this whole messy, brutal ecosystem, the parasites manipulating hosts, predators tearing apart prey, even the genes fighting each other inside our own cells, what is this entire system trying to achieve? If you were an alien scientist studying Earth, what would you conclude is the ultimate goal of all this life?
To answer that, biologists borrow an analytical concept from economics called a utility function. A utility function is simply the variable that a system is actively trying to maximize.
Right.
By looking at a complex machine or a process and reverse engineering its traits, you can figure out its utility function, its overarching purpose.
Okay, so if I look at a car factory, I see assembly lines, robots, and steel deliveries. The utility function is maximizing the number of completed cars produced.
Right. Now, when we look at living bodies, they seem to have purpose written all over them. A cheetah's muscular legs, aerodynamic skull, and non-retractable claws appear perfectly designed for explosive speed and predation.
Definitely.
Meanwhile, a gazelle's wide-set eyes, agile frame, and fast-twitch muscles appear perfectly designed for evasion. So what is God's utility function, so to speak? What is nature actively maximizing?
Well, historically, people thought nature was maximizing the survival of the species, right? The whole circle of life harmony idea, keeping the ecosystem balanced.
Yes, the good of the species fallacy. It's a very comforting idea. But if a divine engineer or a benevolent natural force were maximizing the welfare or the survival of the species, ecosystems would look completely different than they do.
How so?
We would expect to see widespread cooperation to avoid overpopulation. We would see predators and prey managing resources sustainably to avoid mass starvation. We would see animals peacefully stepping aside when they got old to make room for the young. But we don't see any of that.
No, we see the opposite. We see animals hoarding food, killing rivals, and fighting desperately to stay alive.
We see a sadistic arms race. The cheetah is exquisitely designed to kill gazelles, inflicting terror and pain. The gazelle is exquisitely designed to escape, meaning the cheetah starves to death slowly and painfully.
It's just endless suffering.
The amount of suffering in the natural world is staggering and completely unnecessary if the overarching goal was the well-being of organisms or species harmony. The only utility function that makes logical sense of this brutal, endless arms race is DNA survival.
DNA survival, nothing else matters.
Nothing. Evolution maximizes the representation of successful genetic sequences in the next generation. It is utterly indifferent to the suffering, happiness, or survival of the individual vehicles they inhabit. Organisms are ruthlessly exploited and discarded the moment they have served their purpose of transmitting their genes.
Exploited and discarded. I guess that explains why things age and die. Once you've had kids, your genes don't really need you anymore.
Look at the mayfly. It spends months or even years as a nymph underwater, carefully avoiding predators. Then it emerges as a winged adult, mates frantically, and dies within hours.
Within hours.
It doesn't even have a functioning mouth to eat as an adult. Its entire digestive system is vestigial. Its only purpose is to act as a delivery drone for the genetic payload. Or look at animals that endure agonizing parasitic infections or starve during the winter. If an animal is already reproduced and passed on its genes, its survival machine is basically scrap metal to the selective process. Nature doesn't care if it rusts away painfully.
It's a bleak view, I have to admit. But it makes the math work. But wait, I have a question about this ruthless competition.
Okay.
If everything is locked in this zero-sum battle for genetic survival, why aren't animals just constantly fighting to the death over every single scrap of food and every potential mate? Why isn't every interaction in nature a bloodbath?
That brings us to another brilliant application of mathematics to biology, game theory, and specifically the concept of evolutionarily stable strategies, or ESS.
Game theory. That's interesting.
This approach was pioneered by an evolutionary biologist named John Maynard Smith. He realized that the success of a gene's behavioral strategy doesn't just depend on the strategy itself, it depends heavily on what strategies everyone else in the surrounding population is using.
Okay, game theory. Like the prisoner's dilemma in economics. How does this apply to animals fighting over food?
The foundational model for this is known as the hawk-dove game. It's a simplified model of animal conflict.
Okay, let's play the game.
Imagine a population of animals where individuals can adopt one of two genetically programmed strategies when competing for a vital resource, like food or a mating territory. You have hawks, who always fight aggressively until they win the resource or are severely injured.
Right.
And you have doves, who display aggressively. Maybe they puff up their feathers or roar, but will immediately retreat if physically attacked, never risking bodily injury.
Okay. Hawks fight to the death. Doves posture but run away.
Right. Now, what is the best strategy? It depends entirely on the makeup of the population. Let's imagine a world entirely populated by doves. No one ever gets hurt. They just posture until one gets tired and backs down.
It sounds nice.
It seems like a peaceful, optimal utopia. But is it stable?
Let me think. If I'm a dove in a dove world, I do okay. But if random mutation creates one single hawk in that dove population, that hawk is going to have a field day. It will win every single conflict without a scratch because all the doves just run away the second it attacks. The hawk gets all the food, all the mates, and passes on its hawk genes massively.
You nailed it. A population of doves is easily invaded and exploited by mutant hawks. So the hawk genes spread rapidly through the generations. But what happens when the population shifts and becomes overwhelmingly hawks?
Well, now they're all fighting.
Now, nearly every interaction is a vicious, bloody battle. The cost of severe injury skyrockets. In this ultra-violent world, a mutant dove actually has a strange advantage.
Wait, how does a dove have an advantage surrounded by hawks?
Because the dove never wins the big sights, true, but it also never sustains crippling injuries. When two hawks meet, one gets the food, but the other might die or lose an eye. When a dove meets a hawk, the dove loses the food but walks away perfectly healthy.
Ah, I see.
It survives to scavenge another day, meaning it has a higher relative fitness than a hawk bleeding to death from a territorial dispute.
Oh, I see. So the dove genes start to spread because the hawks are killing each other off. Neither strategy can permanently win and take over completely.
Precisely. Neither strategy is an evolutionarily stable strategy on its own. The ESS is a stable polymorphism, a specific mathematical ratio of hawks to doves in the population.
So they balance out.
Let's say it settles at 70% hawks to 30% doves, depending on the exact caloric value of the food and the exact physical cost of injury. At that exact ratio, the average evolutionary payoff for being a hawk equals the average payoff for being a dove. The population balances and stabilizes there.
And this explains why we don't see constant bloodbaths in nature.
Yes. It explains the evolution of ritualized aggression. When you see two massive male deer locking antlers and pushing, or birds doing complex gloved fist wing displays, or wolves baring their teeth but not biting, they aren't holding back for the good of the species to avoid hurting each other.
They're just following the math.
They are enacting an evolutionarily stable strategy. Ritualized combat allows them to assess each other's strength and resolve disputes without incurring the catastrophic costs of full-blown lethal combat. It maximizes the overall survival chances of their genes in that specific social environment.
That is incredibly elegant. Are there other examples of game theory balancing things out like that? What about male to female ratios? I've always wondered why almost every single animal species is roughly 50% male and 50% female.
It's a great question.
If a male can fertilize multiple females, why not have one male and 50 females to maximize population growth?
That is another perfect example explained by what biologists call Fisher's principle. It's all about self-correcting genetic math based on frequency-dependent selection. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine a population that is heavily biased, say, due to some environmental fluke there are 90% females and only 10% males.
Okay.
If you are a parent in that population, what is the best strategy for your genes?
Well, if there are hardly any males, then males are in super high demand. If I have a son, he's going to have his pick of mates. He could father dozens of children. If I have a daughter, she's just one of the crowd competing with all the other females.
Exactly. In a female-dominated population, a random genetic mutation that causes a parent to produce more sons grants a massive reproductive advantage. That parent's son-producing genes will sweep through the population like wildfire because those rare sons are siring almost all the next generation.
Right.
But as those son-producing genes spread, the population ratio inevitably starts to shift. The males become more and more common.
And eventually it overcorrects. There are too many males and not enough females, so the advantage flips. Now, having a daughter is the premium strategy because she's guaranteed to find a mate, while most of the abundant males will die without ever reproducing.
You've got it. The genetic advantage constantly shifts back and forth, correcting any imbalance. The only point where the system stops swinging the evolutionarily stable state is exactly 50.50. At that exact ratio, the genetic payoff for producing a son is exactly equal to the genetic payoff for producing a daughter. The gene-centered view, combined with game theory, perfectly predicts this mathematically stable biological balance.
We've painted a very compelling, almost airtight picture here of the gene pulling all the strings. From chemical washing machines to mind-controlling worms to game theory perfectly balancing the sexes.
It's strong theory.
But science is a constant debate. There is never just one theory that perfectly explains everything without pushback. What do the critics say? Are we being too reductionist by zooming in so far to just the DNA?
It's a very fair question, and the gene-centered view is absolutely not without controversy. There are several major critiques and alternative perspectives that challenge this genic reductionism, and we need to explore them to get the full picture.
Let's hear them.
The first major one is multi-level selection, or MLS, championed by prominent biologists like Elliot Sober and David Sloan Wilson.
Multi-level meaning it doesn't just happen at the microscopic gene level.
Right. They argue that selection doesn't just happen at one level, it acts simultaneously at multiple levels of the biological hierarchy. Genes, individual vehicles, and importantly, whole groups. They argue that group selection is a real causal evolutionary force.
But wait, how would group selection work if we already proved with a hawk-dove game that selfish individuals will just invade and exploit a cooperative group?
Well, MLS proponents acknowledge that selfishness beats altruism within a group. The hawk beats the dove. But, they argue, altruistic groups beat selfish groups overall.
Can you give me a scenario?
Imagine two tribes of early humans facing a brutal, freezing winter. Tribe A is full of selfish individuals who hoard their own firewood and food, refusing to share. Tribe B is full of cooperators who share resources, tend to each other's fires, and huddle for warmth.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Tribe A might freeze to death entirely because they couldn't work together to maintain a large fire. Tribe B survives the winter because of their group cohesion.
So the cooperative group survives, and therefore the altruistic gene spread. Not because the individual beat the other individuals in his tribe, but because his entire team beat the winter.
Yes. MLS proponents suggest that when competition between groups is more severe than competition within groups, higher-level traits like extreme cooperation, morality, and social cohesion can evolve.
But what do the gene-centered folks say to that?
Critics of the strict gene-centered view call eugenic selectionism merely a bookkeeping method. They say, sure, you can tally up the winning alleles at the end of the day and say the cooperative gene increased, but the actual cause of the survival was the complex, emergent property of the group working together.
Ah, I see.
They argue that reducing it all to single selfish genes ignores how phenotypes emerge from massive, complex networks of social interaction.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like saying a basketball team won because their point guard scored more points.
Yeah.
But ignoring that they actually won because of their complex defensive strategy and teamwork. What else? Are there other major critiques?
Yes, there is the neutral theory of molecular evolution proposed by the geneticist Motu Kimura in the late 1960s. This is a fascinating challenge to the idea that natural selection is the director of every tiny biological change.
How so?
The gene-centered view, and Darwinism in general, is highly adaptationist. It assumes that if a genetic trait exists, it must have been actively selected for, because it provided some tangible survival advantage.
Right. The cheetah's legs are long for a reason. The beaver builds a dam for a reason.
But Kimura looked at the molecular level, at the actual microscopic sequence of DNA bases over time, and he argued that the vast majority of evolutionary change at this microscopic level is not driven by natural selection at all. It is driven by random genetic drift.
Drift. Just pure chance. How does that work?
He observed that many mutations are what we call selectively neutral. A copying error alters a piece of DNA or changes a minor amino acid in a protein, but this alteration has absolutely zero effect on the organism's physical fitness.
So it's invisible to evolution.
Exactly. It doesn't help them survive, it doesn't hurt them. Because natural selection can only see traits that affect survival, it is blind to these neutral mutations, so they just drift around in the population randomly.
And sometimes they stick.
Over long periods, just by sheer mathematical chance, some of these neutral mutations will accidentally reach fixation, meaning they become the standard version of the gene in the whole population just through random mating lottery.
So not every gene is a hardened survivor of a ruthless primordial battle. Some of them just floated to the top by dumb luck.
That's the argument. Kimura's theory suggests a massive amount of our genetic diversity is just background noise, challenging the intense, hyper-competitive narrative of the selfish gene.
Wow, okay. Are there any other major pushbacks?
And finally, there is a modern push in biology for what is called the extended evolutionary synthesis, or EES.
Extended synthesis, extending it past just DNA.
Yes. EES proponents argue that the DNA-centric view is simply too narrow to explain the complexity of life. They want to include non-genetic inheritance as major evolutionary drivers. For example, epigenetics.
Oh, epigenetics. I've heard of that.
We've learned that environmental factors like severe starvation, chronic stress, or toxins can cause chemical tags like methyl groups to attach to DNA. These tags literally turn certain genes on or off.
Like switches.
Exactly. And crucially, these switch settings can sometimes be passed down to offspring without changing the underlying ACTG DNA code at all.
So the environment is directly writing information into the inheritance system.
Yes. EES also highlights cultural transmission as an evolutionary force. Think of orca whales. Different pods have entirely different hunting techniques and dialects of song that are taught to the young, not genetically inherited. Or humans passing down the technology to build a fire or a spear. This is information being transmitted, mutated, and selected for, but it is not made of DNA.
And what about how animals adapt during their own lifetimes? Does that factor in?
Absolutely. They emphasize phenotypic plasticity, the incredible ability of an organism to change its physical traits in real time in response to the environment.
Give me an example of that.
Think of a plant growing broader leaves if it finds itself in the shade, or a human building calluses on their hands from hard labor. EES proponents argue that this plasticity often precedes and guides genetic change, making the organism an active creator of its own evolution rather than just a passive, lumbering vehicle waiting for a random genetic mutation to save it.
I have to say, I think these critiques are really valid. The biological world is undeniably messy, it's layered, it's full of feedback loops between the environment and the organism. It doesn't always feel like a clean mathematical equation of selfish molecules.
It rarely is perfectly clean.
So how do biologists reconcile this? How do we balance the undeniable complexity of group dynamics, drift, and epigenetics with this very compelling gene-centered view?
It's the ultimate synthesis happening in modern biology right now. We acknowledge the complexity. Group dynamics absolutely matter in certain contexts. Genetic drift is a massive factor at the molecular level. Epigenetics and environment play massive roles in shaping how the vehicle develops. But, and this is the crucial final point of the gene-centered view, despite all of those higher-level effects, the gene must remain the primary unit of selection.
Why? If the group matters and the environment matters, why does the gene still take the top spot in the hierarchy?
Because we have to return to the criteria we established at the very beginning, in the primordial soup. To build the staggering cumulative complexity of life, the lens of the human eye, the bat's echolocation sonar, the adaptive immune system, you need a unit capable of cumulative adaptation over billions of years.
And that takes us back to the three pillars.
Yes, you need those three pillars: longevity, fecundity, and fidelity.
Live long, copy fast, copy accurately.
Exactly. Let's look at the ephemerality of the organism or the group again. A group of cooperators might survive a harsh winter, but that specific group eventually dies or disperses, or its social structure breaks down.
It's not permanent.
An individual organism is a unique one-off event. Because of the crossing over in sexual reproduction, an individual's specific genome is fragmented and lost forever. There is zero evolutionary fidelity at the level of the individual or the group. Evolution, by its strict mathematical definition, is the change in allele frequencies over time.
The genes are the only things with enough fidelity to keep score over 1 billion years.
The gene is an informational entity that survives the death of its vehicles. It is the immortal coil of information flowing steadily through deep time, accumulating the hard-won lessons of natural selection.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
The higher levels, the individuals, the societies, the ecosystems, they are the spectacular, complex stages upon which the evolutionary play is performed. But the actors, the entities that actually endure from scene to scene, carrying the script forward, are the genes. Every brilliant adaptation we see, whether it's the camouflage of a peppered moth, the intricate social hierarchy of a wolf pack, or the mind-bending metabolic precision of a single cell, they are all built bit by bit, mutation by mutation, through the differential survival of the microscopic alleles that encode them.
So what did this all mean for you, the listener? We've gone from the chaotic chemistry of the primordial soup, through the horrifying mind control of parasites, into the game theory of animal combat, and back out to the immortal coil of DNA.
It's quite a journey.
The profound perspective shift here is moving away from the well-being of the individual, moving away from your own main character syndrome in the movie of your life, and focusing on the pure, unbroken survival of information. We are all temporary scaffolding. We are the organic robots programmed to carry the real masters through time.
It is a humbling view of our place in the universe, but I also find it deeply awe-inspiring to realize that the unbroken chain of successful information inside your cells stretches back 4 billion years without a single break.
It is incredible, and I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day in your very complex vehicle.
What is it?
The next time you experience a deep visceral instinct, whether it's the sudden, overwhelming urge to protect a family member from harm, A flare of hot territorial aggression when someone cuts you off in traffic, or even just a fleeting magnetic romantic attraction to a stranger across a room. Take a second to pause and ask yourself,
Yeah.
is this truly my desire? Or am I just feeling the ancient calculated tug of a selfish molecule maneuvering for its next jump through time?